Good morning. I want to grab something here and share it online if I can. Yep. So I'm giving you a quote that I think is very helpful for understanding this particular chapter, which is a little more dense. Well, I don't know if it's dense, but it's just not as it's not something that people would typically think about. So they may not be, um, you might not clue into it as fast as you would some of the other chapters. And so we're to spend a little bit of time unpacking it in a way that is more meaningful to you than what it might be otherwise. So you on the bottom part there in the comments section, if you can read it, where I've posted a quote by a philosopher, and probably gives one of the best definitions of the word shalom that may have ever been. I mean, it's just a phenomenal word. So you're familiar with the Aramaic or the Hebrew word shalom. When we read the word peace in the New Testament, it is the word irene, and so that's what's used. Um, Irene in the Greek means peace, but it does not carry with it, I don't think, the fullness of the Hebrew word shalom. It's really the closest approximation that the Greek words have for the word shalom. Certainly, there is no word in the English language that captures all the beautiful and wonderful nuances of that Hebrew shalom either. It is entirely unique in that regard. So there's a poverty of both, I think, the English and somewhat the Greek capturing the fullness of this word that really, and I don't know that Lewis was thinking of this word when he wrote the chapter, but he's certainly thinking out of this idea of the absence of shalom when it comes to the principles that he's talking about. So I want to read this to you, and then after that, we will read some scripture that I think would be helpful, and then we can go into the chapter itself. So, in his book, A Breviary of Sin, Planticus says this about shalom. He says, in the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed, a state of affairs that inspires joyful wonder at its creator, who opens doors and welcomes the creatures in which he delights. Shalom in things ought to be. So, good morning, Bonnie and Rocky. Good morning, Carol. And so you can see that quote that I have down there for you. Feel free to. I think that quote is a keeper. I think it. So if anybody ever wanted cross stitching for me that I could frame, I would love that because I can't cross stitch, but that quote is worth that you would put it into, cross stitching something and then putting, so it's something that we should not only aspire to, but whether we believe it or not, it is something that most of us long for. It's innate, it's endemic to us. It's a part of our DNA. It's a composite. It's interwoven in the imago Dei, the imaged of Godness of God in us. It's a part of the Selim Elohim that the Jews talk about when they say the image of God. So it is that, and it's a wonderful, wonderful truth and sentiment. So I want to read to you some passages of scripture, and um, we'll go from there. So the first one I want to read is from the Gospel of John, and it's just a short text, but it's the last third of we were to enter into the passion portion of the Gospel of John, and so he's really speaking on behalf of his disciples, and so he says in verse 27 of John 14, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you, as the world gives, do I give to you." So he's saying, peace, shalom, irene, I leave with you. My peace, the very peace of God, he's saying, I give you. So these things have been given to us, and they are all ours to participate in, to embrace and to hold, and to make ours. So then in Philippians chapter 2, which is a very well-known passage. I'm sorry, chapter 4, where he says, "Before rejoice in the Lord always, I will say, rejoice. Let your reasonableness be made known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God," which is what Jesus was talking about here earlier in John. So it's God's peace, that when we do our part through prayer and supplication and our pursuit of Him, then God meets us and He gives us His peace, and the kind of peace of understanding, and it will guard our heart and our minds in Christ Jesus. So our hearts do need to be guarded, and our minds do need to be guarded, because when we get into this chapter, you'll see how the hearts and the minds, patient as well as ours by extension, if we are not living in God's peace, then our hearts remain. If we're not living in the things that bring about the peace of our hearts and minds, then we make ourselves really susceptible, in a variety of ways that could be very, very destructive. So in 16, and this is really kind of what I would consider in many respects the core, of the theme. Apostle Paul says to the Christians in Thessalonica, this is 2 Thessalonians 3:16. "Now the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times in every way." Now may the Lord of peace himself, that is Jesus Christ, give you peace, his peace. I mean, who would not want the peace of God, right? Give you peace at all times in every way. The Lord be with you all. So, three great texts, I think, that are helpful for understanding this chapter. Certainly very helpful in terms of understanding or applying it. And so if you want to open up your books, we'll begin. That is the group of Christians that are associated with his girlfriend, who's also a very solid Christian. The real trouble about the set your patient is living in is that it is merely Christian. They all have individual interests, of course, but the bond remains mere Christianity. I'm going to turn my phone off so that I get less interference from the. So they all have individual interests, of course, but the bond remains mere Christianity. It doesn't mean that in a bad way. What we want, if men become Christians at all, is to keep them in the state of mind I call Christianity and Christianity and Christianity and the crisis. And he gives a list of them here, some of them which are pretty banal. I mean, they're just like, you can't believe that people would attach the word Christian to something as obscure or as absurd as that, but we do that, don't we? If men become Christians at all, to keep them in a state of mind, I call Christianity and, you know, Christianity and the crisis, the new psychology, Christianity and the new order, Christianity and faith healing, psychical research, Christianity and vegetarianism, Christianity and spelling reform. So you can see he gets is that we structure or like principles, the technique. There really isn't any to do dentistry properly, that if you were a Christian, you would do it there are no Christian techniques of dentistry to extract a tooth or to put a filling in or those kinds of things. There really is, for the most part, unless you're obscene, there's really no way to do, Christian aerobics. And so what we've done in many respects is we've added to, you know, a profession or a hobby like that, and we've attached the word Christian means something in addition to. Whereas what really is truly Christian is that somebody can say, well, he's a Christian dentist, and that might be helpful if you want to patronize dentists who are Christian and who do good work. Because they're a Christian doesn't mean they're a good dentist, right? I mean, we know plenty of good Christians who are terrible business people, right? We all know that. So really, what we're looking for is a person, a particular kind of work, and they do it as Christianly as they possibly can. Out of the worldview, the ethic, so that as a dentist, you're compassionate, you're careful, you're thorough, you commit yourself to excellence, as Christians should do, because that's just who we should be. But there isn't anything in the Bible that says this is how you do dentistry, right? And so what Lewis is getting at is that there's this kind of shallowness that many Christians exercise, where they are this, and then they attach the Christian label to it. That was particularly true and very prominent back in the 1980s and 90s, as I recall. I mean, it was just all over the place in that regard. But Lewis spotted this kind of thing all the way back in 1942. And again, it's a history repeats itself. So then he goes on to say, if they must be Christians, let them at least be Christians with a different substitute for the faith itself, some fashion with a Christian coloring, which is exactly what I've just described to you. Work their horror of the same old thing. And so Lewis is getting to this point where among people and in Christians in general, that there's this thing where we just continue to do the same thing over and over again, and we become bored with it. And so we try to spice it up. Because we're just afraid of something being the same old thing. And so we'll get to what he means by that. He says the horror of the same old thing is one of the most valuable passions we have produced in the human heart. An endless source of heresies, which is absolutely true. I mean, look, at least in part of my world, it's amazing what people who are in higher education, so a PhD candidate who needs to write a thesis, and it's a big deal to write a thesis. It's a tremendous amount of work, and so he needs to write a thesis. So, but he needs to write a thesis on something that's really unique because he needs to get their attention and he needs to demonstrate some kind of work that is original that no one else has thought about. You would not believe the areas that theologians, doctoral students pursue, where they get at certain portions of scripture and, in essence, dismantle, destroy, corrupt, about the scriptures or theology just to get a degree, to make a name for themselves. They want to get away from the same old thing and come up with something that's unique that will distinguish them, that will make them different, right? And which is fine in many respects, but what can't be fine is the dismantling, the corruption, destruction of the biblical text itself, which happens all the time, where theologians try to, and the same is true in constitutional law. So, scholars writing doctoral dissertations go at, the Constitution in new and in different ways, writing about it, asking it to do things that really it was never intended to do. And as a result, undermining principles that were part of our Constitution. So it is, all of this is pretty widespread and endless. So he says, so I'll just go back here. He says, the horror of the same thing is one of the most valuable passions we have produced in the human heart, and endless heresies in religion, folly in counsel, right? So people like, I'm bored. And so they go to a counselor, and counselors just, say, well, have you tried this and have you tried that? And did you do this? And maybe you do a little more spice in your life and, all of those kinds of things. And again, I mean, I have heard things that counselors have said to people that would curl your toenails. Like, how could you possibly say something like that? Um, and just because a person is bored because they haven't found their peace. They haven't found, the peace that God has given to them. So folly in counsel, infidelity in marriage, which is oftentimes counseled. I mean, if you're bored, then it's not your fault. It's not their fault. Just find someone else that can make you happy. Infidelity in marriage and inconstancy in friendship. So rather than work through and those dry times in a friendship, dump them. Find somebody else who's more interesting and more exciting. The humans live in time and experience reality successively. To experience, therefore, they must experience many differences. In other words, they must experience change. And since they need change, the enemy, that is being a hedonist at heart, has made change pleasurable to them. Well, at least to most people. Some people don't like change, but just as he has made eating pleasurable. But since he does not wish them to make change any more than eating an end in itself. So change happens out of necessity. Change doesn't. So, in other words, he's saying there are people who, after a certain period of time, they just change things up just to keep things interesting. And so change becomes an end in itself. Like for some people, how food becomes everything all about getting food and eating food. Everything is bent in that, like money or wealth. So it's about acquiring wealth. It's not about use for some good. It's about hoarding wealth to oneself. And there are people who embrace change just for the sake of change. There's no rationale behind it other than the fact that they might be bored, and so they want to do something different. He has balanced the love of change in them by a love of permanence, and so he doesn't want change to become an end in and of itself. God has placed within us both a love for change, because change brings about growth, and then for permanence, that we like stability as well. So he has contrived to gratify. I see more joining us here. So I'm in the, for those of you who are just joining me, I'm in the second paragraph of chapter 25, the bottom of the second paragraph of chapter 25. And we've talked about so far about uh, the idea of being a, a, a person who does things Christianly rather than a professional who says that they're a Christian, the importance of that distinction. We've talked about how change, the use of change, because we are bored, can be used by Satan as an end in of itself, rather than change being a part of the continuum for growth and for progress and for development, as it should be. And then we're talking here about how God has placed within us both a a love for change so that we can grow and evolve, and as well as a sense of permanence. We like stability. Stability is important to us. He has contrived to gratify both tastes together in this very world he has made by the union of change and the permanence we call rhythm. So God has hardwired humans to enjoy change when it's necessary, and the growth that it brings, the freshness that it brings, and those kinds of things like that. And yet, at the same time, the stability of family, the stability of work, the stability of living in one place, the stability of a certain friend group, all those kinds of things are very life affirming and helpful to us. So there's this tension, this healthy tension between both change and permanence. And he's saying that when that change and permanence happens, we achieve a kind of rhythm. By that word rhythm, I think he means shalom. So by the healthy tension and balance that comes with out of the necessity for change and the necessity for permanence, we enter into this rhythm of life that I think really what he means by that is shalom. And so I just want to read that again, because now it makes sense why I'm using the word shalom. So Plantinga says this: in the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed. A state of affairs that inspires joyful wonder at its creator and savior, who opens doors and welcomes the creatures in whom he delights. Shalom, in other words, is the way things ought to be. That's Cornelius Plantinga in his book, A Breviary of Sin. So then he goes on to say, gives them the seasons, each season different, every year the same, so that spring is always felt as a novelty, yet always as the reoccurrence of an immemorial theme. So the permanency, there are 4 seasons, but each of those seasons are refreshed and relatively new. And as we move from season to season, we find ourselves almost the next season coming up, because there's this rhythm, and the permanency of those 4 seasons is helpful to us and life giving in many ways, not just metaphysically in our minds, but literally, in terms of what it does to the earth, how it grows things, how we harvest, all of those kinds of things as a part of the seasons by way of example. He gives them in his church a spiritual year, They change from fast to a feast, but it is the same feast as before. Now, just as we pick out and exaggerate the pleasure of eating to produce gluttony, so we pick out this natural pleasantness of change and twist it into end for absolute novelty. This is, I think, one of the key statements that he making here, and I think it's a dynamic. It's a truth for all of us. Now, just as we pick out and exaggerate the pleasure of eating, produce, right? So you can't get enough, and you want more than anybody else has, and it's insatiable. So we pick out this natural pleasantness of change and twist it into a demand for absolute novelty. And this I mean, transcultural. I mean, it's all across our culture in so many different ways. I mean, the pursuit of novelty, so that, even on Facebook, how many likes did I get? Did I get more than anybody else get? Did I distinguish myself in my comment? Have I demonstrated that I am a true social justice warrior? Or that I am intelligent, or I want to be unique and distinct. And the goal to be just unique and distinct and not to convey something that's really, really important, but simply to find a way to make yourself or what you're about more than what anybody else is about. This is the spirit of our age in so many ways. This is a workmanship, Screwtape says. If we neglect our duty, mankind will not only be content, but transported by the mixed novelty and the familiarity of snowdrops this January, sunrise this morning, plum pudding this Christmas. Children, until we have taught them better, will be perfectly happy with a seasonal round of games in which he uses the word conkers here. I'm not sure what conkers is, but it's a game in England. Will it succeed hopscotch as regularly as autumn follows summer? Only by our incessant efforts is the demand for infinite or unrhythmical change kept up. And so never live in peace. Always never live but always look down the road for that next great thing, because this thing right now isn't that great. So, and if we are going to make it great, then it's going to be uniquely novel to us, different than everybody else, so that we can say that it's that. And so we are distinct in that way. This demand is valued in various ways. In the first place, it diminishes increasing desire. So for the next great thing, because we are bored in this moment, because we don't want to live in this moment, even that's where we find ourselves. And we don't want to enjoy and be at peace with what's going on in our life right now, but we're always looking for down the road, right? Then what he's saying happens, it diminishes the pleasure of the moment while increasing desire for what we think we want. And so we're always looking for that thing we think we want, rather than the moment, and being at peace with the moment and with whatever God has brought to us at that time. Then he goes on to say, and continued novelty costs money, so that the desire for it spells avarice or unhappiness or both. And again, the more rapturous this desire, the sooner up all the innocent sources of pleasure and pass on those the enemy forbids. And so, what he's saying here is this this desire to want something that is novel and unique causes us to ignore or even to use those things now that are supposed to cause us pleasure and happiness and peace, and to use them in ways they ought not to be used in order to get what we think we want down the road that we're not getting now. Thus, by inflaming the horror of the same old thing, we have recently made the arts, for example, less dangerous to us than perhaps they have been they have ever been. So I don't know how many of you know this, but the classic arts for almost 2 centuries were almost entirely devoted to giving God glory. I mean, stunning. I mean, if you look at the classic, sort of the classical arts, so much of it was about giving God glory and honor. And then Lewis is saying, but right now, because people are disenchanted, because they are not at peace, because because it's out of balance between change and permanency. So, what was once a permanent theme about why we do art now no longer exists. It's boring. We don't like it. And so we want, and besides that, it doesn't distinguish us because who produce it. So we're going to go off and produce something different. So if you want to see an absolute world of wacky, I mean, there is no rock turned in terms of what they will try to produce to make themselves unique. So if you went into the Chicago Museum of Christ, so you could walk down into, I want to see a beaker with yellow fluid in it and a crucifix in it, and the entitlement is piss Christ. But that's art. Or you could try and walk from one large room to another large room. And in order to walk into that room, you have to walk up a flag. So you walk across the flag to another room. That's art. It's protected. So meanwhile, there's some Christian art out there that is offensive, can't be, but this other art can be used. So he's saying here, let me just read that again. Thus, by inflaming the horror of the same old thing, we have recently made the arts, for example, less dangerous to us than perhaps they have ever been. And I would say that if that was true then, it's true in spades today. So, I mean, consider that what you watch on TV. Consider that when you go to a movie theater and you thought a film was about one thing, but then you saw it was really kind of about another, and that there were things that were, it's still considered to be art, and that art is produced because they're looking for something novel, something unique, some place to carve out for themselves a place of distinction because they're bored with art. I said in church on Sunday that you can accuse somebody of as being average or normal. We're just not at peace with that. So then it goes on to say, arts, for example, less than perhaps ever been. Lowbrow and highbrow artists alike being now daily drawn into fresh and still fresh excessive lasciviousness, unreason, cruelty, and pride. There was a tremendous amount of art that was employed in during the Nazi regime time. So much of the imagery, for example, that we understand about Satan, he has horns, he has a long thin tail that's kind of barbed, he's red, he's got sharp teeth, he's got claws. Much of that imagery came from Nazi Germany, and it was likened to the Jews. So it was their way of demonizing the Jews. They would depict the Jews, in some cases, sharing those same kinds of characteristics as Satan himself. So the use of fashions in thought is to distract the attention of men from their real dangers. We direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those it is least in danger, and fix its approval on the virtue nearest to that vice, which we are trying to make endemic. So this is that Isaiah passage where good is bad and bad is good. That's what he's saying here. So he's saying we direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices of which it is least in danger of. So we get people. So, for example, the whole idea of gender, right? Of us who are conservative say this is child abuse with what you're doing to children, uh, uh, allowing the very young age to change their gender, to take medications, and to get their bodies altered, and so culture says, you are making a mountain out of a molehill. That is not a big deal. So, but ages that I would want to do something like that. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about all those kinds of things we experience today, where the enemy says we direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices of which it is least in danger. So we'll take the less dangerous vices, and we'll get people to really go bonkers over it, and fix its approval on the virtue nearest to that vice that we are trying to make endemic or a part of culture itself, a permanent change, so that they want to permanently change in terms of how children choose their identity, how we see a whole host of other things that historically we saw as being evil and wicked, but now the culture is saying it's not a big deal. You're uninformed, you're uneducated, you're oppressive, you're intolerant, you're all of those things. So it's a complete switch. So so it's that Isaiah passage where he talks about how a person is cursed for those who say sweet is bitter, bitter is sweet, good is bad, bad is good, those kinds of things. The game is to have them all running about with fire extinguishers whenever there is a flood, and all crowding to that side of the boat which is already nearly gunwale under. Thus, we make it fashionable to expose the dangers of enthusiasm at the very moment when they are all really becoming worldly and lukewarm. A century later, when we are really making them all Byronic and drunk with emotion, the outcry is directed against the dangers of how things have been flipped, and they're because people just want change for change's sake, not because change is good, and because people are trying to, in some respects, make something novel for themselves when it's dangerous for others. Cruel ages put on their guard against sentimentality, feckless and idle ones against respectability, lecherous ones against puritanism. And whenever all men are really hastening to be slaves or tyrants, we make liberalism the prime boogie. So it's all about changing things around. It's upside down, in opposition. What was good is now bad. What was bad is now good. But the greatest triumph of all is to elevate this horror of the same old thing into a philosophy, so that the nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption of the will. Nonsense in the intellect about how we think about things into the corrupt. And this is exactly what is happening in the culture. So people could be really, really well educated, but not have any wisdom at all. So just because you're smart doesn't mean that you're wise. And so is that the nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption in the will. And so the nonsense that we teach our students in school and in college, university, is being reflected in how they live their lives and give themselves permission to do. And they are also very open to that because it's the same old thing otherwise. And the same old thing isn't good. That permanence good, even though it's intended to be good, even though it's classic, even though it's associated with those eternal things of God. It is here that the general evolutionary or historical character of modern Europe, thought partly our work, comes so usefully. The enemy loves platitudes. Of a proposed course of action, he wants men, so far as I can see, to ask very simple questions. These are the questions. Is it righteous? Is it prudent? Now, if we can keep men asking, is it in accordance with the general movement of our time? Is it progressive or reactionary? Is this the way that history is going? They will neglect those relevant questions. It's exactly. Look, he couldn't be describing the progressive questions any better. These are exactly the questions of progressivism in our time today. Exactly. I'll read them again. So, so the wise person, the 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 mature Christian says, uh, he asks these questions: Is it righteous? Is it prudent? Is this a smart thing to do? Is it even possible? Should we even attempt this? That's what mature believers ask. And so if change needs to come about, then we ask it because it's righteous or because it's prudent or because it really is possible. But Screwtape is saying, but we don't want them to ask those questions. These are the questions we want them to ask. If we can keep men asking, is it in accordance with the general movement of our time? Is it progressive or reactionary? Is this the way that history is going? Then they ask these relevant questions. And the questions they do ask unanswerable, for they do not know the future. And what the future will be depends very largely on just those choices which they now invoke the future to help them make. As a result, while their minds are buzzing in this vacuum, we have the chance to slip in and bend them the action we have decided on. A great work has already been done. Knew that some change for the better and others for the worse, and others again indifferent. We have substituted the emotional adjective stagnant. We have trained them to think of the future as a promised land which favored heroes attain, not as something which everyone reaches at the rate of 60 miles, 60 minutes an hour, whatever he does, whoever he is. So, this chapter is a little more dense because he's talking about something that is, uh, more ethereal, more philosophical. Um, but again, this chapter would be one of those chapters that would make Lewis a postmodern prophet. That he's really good at capturing what is happening in his time and then describing it, and then we're seeing a more mature fruit of that in our time and in our day. So this has not been a chapter that I've focused on a whole lot in the past. But having read it and done it in this podcast, it's probably a chapter I'm going to spend more time on because of what I think that he's saying here is so vitally important. In other words, if our lives are guided by great principles that belong to God, then when they are guided by those principles, then there are some things that necessarily must stay the same. And there are some things, because of their inadequacy, because of their corruption, that must be changed. The problem is that we are also very confused about what any of that looks like now. And as according to Screwtape here, we've done great work in duping us. And we could point to any number of things in our culture now that stark evidence of that very thing. So I hope you found this to be helpful, and as always, share it with somebody that you think might do it. I will see you. This Sunday is Palm Sunday, so make sure that if you can be there, that'd be great. We'll have some palms handed out, and then a Tenebrae service on Thursday, and an Easter egg hunt on Friday, and then we have Sunday. So I hope you can join us and be a part of that. So thank you very much, and I will see you soon. God bless. Bye-bye.